February 9, 1904, in the freezing waters off Chemulpo Bay, Korea, a Russian captain stood on the deck of one of the most technologically advanced warships of the era. Surrounded by an entire Japanese fleet, Captain Vsevolod Rudnev faced a choice that would define naval lore for the next century: surrender his pride and his vessel, or sail into a certain suicide mission. He chose the latter. By sunset, the Varyag was a burning wreck at the bottom of the ocean. To the world, she was a tragic footnote of the Russo-Japanese War. But for this specific hull, sinking was merely the opening chapter. Over the next 2 decades, this ship would be resurrected from the mud, renamed by an emperor, used to train the very sailors who sank her, and eventually sold back to the nation that lost her. This is a narrative of the most complex salvage operation of the early 20th century, a feat of engineering that defied the physical limits of the time. To understand why the international community was obsessed with the salvage of this ship, one must understand the prestige of the Varyag. In the late 1890s, the Russian Empire was locked in a frantic arms race, requiring protected cruisers fast enough to outrun battleships and robust enough to dismantle merchant supply lines. Interestingly, the Varyag was not a product of Russian industry. She was built in the United States at the William Cramp & Sons shipyard in Philadelphia. Launched in 1899, she was an engineering marvel featuring 4 towering funnels, 12 6-inch guns, and a top speed of 23 knots. While she was Philadelphia fast, she was mechanically temperamental, powered by notoriously finicky Niklas boilers, a technical detail that would prove critical during her first and final combat engagement. The Russo-Japanese War began with a swift ultimatum. Admiral Yuri Osotakichi signaled the Varyag with a clear demand: leave the neutral port by noon or be destroyed at anchor. Rudnev knew the odds. The Japanese had 6 cruisers and 8 torpedo boats waiting in the narrow, treacherous channel. The Varyag had only the aging gunboat Korets for support. The ensuing Battle of Chemulpo Bay lasted barely an hour. The Varyag was pummeled by 11 heavy shell hits, her upper deck became a scene of carnage, and her steering gear was shattered. Listing heavily and unable to maneuver, Rudnev limped back into the harbor's neutral zone. Determined to prevent the Japanese from claiming a prize of war, he ordered the seacocks opened. The Varyag settled into the soft silt of the harbor floor, her port side submerged and her funnels poking out of the water like grave markers. To the Russians, the ship was a martyr, but to the Japanese, she was a high-value asset sitting in remarkably shallow water. The challenge for the Japanese Navy was that the Varyag lay in a region with some of the most extreme tidal ranges on Earth. In Chemulpo, the tide fluctuates by nearly 30 feet, meaning the wreck was subjected to massive hydraulic pressures twice every day. The Japanese brought in their premier engineering minds, not just to clear the shipping lane, but to seize the ship as a trophy of their rising industrial might. However, the Varyag had settled deep into the harbor mud. The suction of the silt on a 6,500-ton hull created a physical bond that threatened to snap the ship in half if she were pulled too aggressively. The salvage would require more than just brute force. It would require a mastery of buoyancy and physics that had rarely been tested on this scale. The Japanese salvage effort began in earnest in 1904, led by a team of naval architects who viewed the Varyag as a masterclass in American naval construction they were eager to reverse engineer. The primary obstacle was the suction effect of the Chemulpo silt. To break this grip, engineers first had to lighten the ship while she was still submerged. Divers, working in near-zero visibility and fighting the massive 30-foot tidal shifts, spent months removing the ship's heavy coal reserves, ammunition, and the remains of her 12 6-inch guns. This was a grueling process. The divers used early manual air pumps and copper helmets, often forced to stop work entirely when the tide rushed in, creating dangerous currents that could pin a man against the hull. Once the ship was lightened, the Japanese implemented a massive cofferdam strategy. This involved building a watertight wooden wall around the portions of the ship that remained above the waterline at low tide. This structure allowed engineers to pump water out of the hull even as the tide rose around it. The goal was to create enough internal buoyancy to lift the ship out of the mud naturally. However, the first several attempts failed. The mud held fast, and the sheer weight of the water remaining in the lower compartments was too much for the primitive steam pumps of 1905. The engineers realized they needed to create an air pocket within the hull itself, essentially turning the Varyag into its own flotation device. Success finally came in August 1905. Using a combination of high-capacity pumps and massive external pontoons, large, hollow tanks that were flooded, attached to the hull, and then pumped dry, the Japanese managed to break the suction. With a sickening, rhythmic thud that witnesses described as sounding like a giant heartbeat, the Varyag finally detached from the seafloor. As the tide rose, the ship rose with it for the first time in over a year. She was towed to the nearby port of Incheon for temporary repairs. The hull was remarkably intact despite the shells and the scuttling, a testament to the steel quality used at the Philadelphia shipyard. In 1907, after extensive repairs at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, the ship was officially commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. She was no longer the Varyag, she was renamed the Soya, after a cape on the island of Hokkaido. For the next 9 years, the ship served a poetic and ironic role. She became a primary training vessel for Japanese naval cadets. The very men who were learning how to build a world-class navy were doing so on the deck of the ship their predecessors had sunk. The Japanese didn't just use her for training, they meticulously studied her American-made engines and structural layout, incorporating those lessons into their own burgeoning domestic shipbuilding programs. However, the geopolitical winds were shifting. By 1914, the world was at war, and the old enemies, Russia and Japan, found themselves as unlikely allies against the Central Powers. Russia was desperate for warships, having lost most of its Baltic and Pacific fleets during the war with Japan a decade earlier. In 1916, the Japanese government made a diplomatic gesture that remains nearly unique in naval history. They offered to sell the Soya back to the Russians. For a price of 4 million yen, the ship was handed back to its original owners. In a grand ceremony in Vladivostok, the Japanese flag was lowered, the Russian flag was raised, and she was officially renamed the Varyag once again. The return of the Varyag to the Russian flag in 1916 was not the end of her ordeal, but the beginning of a journey that would take her halfway across the globe to the heart of the British Empire. Upon her return, the Russian Admiralty realized that the ship, while structurally sound, was technologically obsolete and battered by years of Japanese service. She was sent on a perilous voyage from the Pacific, through the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean, eventually reaching the United Kingdom. Her destination was the Camel Laird shipyard in Birkenhead, England. The goal was a complete modernization, new guns, updated electronics, and a total overhaul of those temperamental boilers that had plagued her since she left Philadelphia. While the Varyag sat in dry dock in northern England, history moved faster than the shipwright's hammers. In 1917, the Russian Revolution erupted. The Tsarist government collapsed, replaced by the Bolsheviks who eventually pulled Russia out of World War I. This created a legal and diplomatic nightmare for the British. The new Soviet government refused to pay the massive debts incurred for the Varyag's refit. In response, the British government seized the ship as collateral. The legendary cruiser, once the pride of the Romanovs and then a trophy of the Japanese emperor, was now a homeless hulk of steel being used as a floating barracks for the Royal Navy. By 1920, the British decided that the aging cruiser was no longer worth the cost of maintenance. She was sold for scrap to a German firm. However, the Varyag had one final act of defiance left in her. As she was being towed through the Irish Sea toward the breakers' yards in Germany, she encountered a fierce gale off the coast of Scotland. On February 5, 1925, the tow line snapped. The powerless ship drifted into the treacherous rocks near the village of Lendlefoot. She ran aground in shallow water, refusing to be taken to the furnace. For the locals in Scotland, the massive four-funneled ghost ship became a permanent fixture of the horizon. Salvage crews eventually arrived, but the Varyag was stubborn. Because she was grounded on a rocky shelf in a high-energy surf zone, traditional dismantling was nearly impossible. The salvors managed to strip her upper works and her precious non-ferrous metals, brass, copper, and bronze, but the Great Depression and the onset of World War II halted the operation. Eventually, the remains of the hull were dynamited to prevent them from becoming a hazard to navigation. What was left of the hero of Chemulpo slipped beneath the Scottish waves, where she remains to this day. The legacy of the Varyag is unparalleled in naval history. She is the only ship to have been a commissioned warship in the navies of the United States, during trials, Russia, and Japan. Today, she is remembered not as a pile of scrap metal in Scotland, but as a symbol of resilience. In 2007, a special monument was erected in Lendlefoot, Scotland, overlooking the site of her final rest. It serves as a tribute to the sailors of 1904 and the incredible engineering journey of a ship that was born in America, died in Korea, was reborn in Japan, and finally chose her own grave in the United Kingdom. The Japanese salvage of 1905 was not merely an act of lifting a ship, it was an act of surgical reconstruction. When the Varyag was finally pulled into the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Japanese engineers discovered the true extent of the damage. The Russian scuttling had been effective but rushed. While the seacocks were open, the internal watertight doors had not all been sealed, meaning the silt of Chemulpo Bay had permeated every square inch of the ship's internal machinery. This created a secondary, salvage, challenge, the removal of thousands of tons of solidified Korean mud from the delicate boiler tubes and engine cylinders. This process alone took 6 months of manual labor, with Japanese workers literally scraping the American steel clean by hand. The technical transformation from Varyag to Soya involved more than a name change. The Japanese were unimpressed with the original French-designed Nicholas boilers. During the refit, they experimented with ways to stabilize the ship's power output, eventually replacing much of the piping and auxiliary pumps with British and Japanese-made components. This hybrid engineering turned the Soya into a unique laboratory. For the Japanese, the ship was a Rosetta Stone of naval architecture. By studying the way the Philadelphia shipbuilders had laid the armored deck, a curved, turtleback design meant to deflect shells, Japanese designers gained insights that would later influence the construction of their own indigenous cruisers, like the Chikuma class. This period of her life is often glossed over, but for the data-driven enthusiast, it represents a massive transfer of technology from west to east, facilitated entirely by a successful salvage operation. By the time the ship was sold back to Russia in 1916 for 4 million yen, she was a mechanical chimera, an American hull, with French-designed engines, maintained for a decade by Japanese technicians, now being operated by a Russian crew that had largely forgotten how she worked. The voyage from Vladivostok to the Arctic port of Romanov na Main, now Murmansk, was a grueling 15,000-mile odyssey. The Varyag suffered multiple mechanical breakdowns in the Indian Ocean. Her crew, many of whom were inexperienced conscripts, struggled to maintain the aging boilers. When she finally arrived in British waters for her refit at Camel Laird, she was in such poor condition that British engineers suggested it might be cheaper to build a new ship from scratch. But for the Russian Empire, the Varyag was a matter of national soul. They insisted on the refit, unaware that the Romanov dynasty had only months left to live. The abandonment of the ship in 1917 created a unique legal salvage case. When the British government seized the Varyag in lieu of payment from the new Bolshevik government, the ship became a literal ghost. She was stripped of her guns, which were repurposed for British coastal defense. Her once proud engines were left to seize in the damp British air. When she was eventually sold to the German firm B. Reitman & Co. for scrap in 1920, she was valued at just a few £1,000s, a staggering fall for a ship that had once cost the Tsar millions in gold. The final battle of the Varyag occurred off the coast of Lendlefoot, Scotland. This is where the narrative of the ship that wouldn't die reaches its peak. When the towline snapped during that 1925 storm, the Varyag didn't just drift, she navigated. She missed several jagged outcrops that would have sent her to deep water and instead wedged herself firmly onto a rocky shelf known as the Fairland Rocks. This created a nightmare for the commercial salvers. Because the ship was grounded in the intertidal zone, she was subject to the relentless pounding of the Firth of Clyde. The Salvage Company, the fourth shipbreaking company, attempted to dismantle her in situ. They built a temporary jetty out to the wreck, but the Scottish weather was unforgiving. Every time they made progress, a new storm would roll in from the Atlantic and tear away their equipment. For several years, the Varyag sat as a massive steel reef. Local legends in Lendlefoot tell of villagers rowing out to the wreck to scavenge what the professional salvers left behind. It is said that more than a few Scottish homes in the 1930s were furnished with mahogany doors and brass fittings that bore the imperial stamp of the William Cramp and Sons shipyard. The end finally came through the use of high explosives. In the late 1920s and early 30s, the hull was blasted apart to recover the heavy steel of the double bottom. But even then, the sea reclaimed a portion of her. The lower hull and the massive engine beds were too heavy and too well settled into the rocky crevices to be moved. Today, these remains lie in just 6 to 8 meters of water. They have become an artificial reef, teeming with North Atlantic life, a quiet end for a ship that spent its youth amidst the roar of 6-inch guns and the smoke of coal fires. For the modern observer, the Varyag's story is the ultimate example of the salvage and resurrection cycle. She was a ship of 3 lives. In her first life, she was a symbol of Russian imperial overreach and American industrial might. In her second, she was a trophy of Japanese rising power and a teacher to a new generation of admirals. In her third, she was a tragic wanderer, caught in the gears of global revolution and world war. What makes the Varyag win, as a narrative, is that she never actually lost a battle to the sea. She was scuttled by her own crew, raised by her enemies, and finally, she chose her own place of rest on the Scottish coast, refusing to be broken down in a German furnace. She remains a bridge between nations. In 2009, in a gesture of profound historical symmetry, the Russian Navy visited the site of the wreck in Scotland, and the Varyag's original ensign, the very flag that flew during the Battle of Chemulpo, was returned to Russia on loan from the South Korean government, which had recovered it from an Incheon museum. The Varyag is a reminder that in the world of naval history, a ship is never truly gone as long as its story is told. From the shipyards of Philadelphia to the mud of Korea, from the dry docks of Japan to the rocks of Scotland, the Varyag didn't just change 3 navies, she defined them. She was the ship that refused to stay sunk, a ghost of the old world that haunted the 20th century until she found a shore that would finally hold her.